Have you ever wondered what is hidden behind ordinary things? Behind the stone of an old church, behind a flower in a forgotten cemetery, behind the silence of a snowy wasteland, behind the words in an old book. We try to explain the world, find logic, find God, but sometimes the answers don't save. Sometimes they just open the door. And something on the other side is looking at us. Today I will tell you a few stories. Stories about choice. About what a person is ready to give for the sake of life, faith, knowledge, or just hope. But remember, there is a question hidden in every story. And I want to hear your answer. After everything you've heard, what scares you more, losing your soul or finding the real, terrible truth about the world? Leave your opinion in the comments. It's important. And let's start with a story about faith. Not the one in books, but the one that survives in stone and drought. It was said that the village of Stone March was not merely cut off from the world, but actively hid from it. Tucked deep within a forgotten valley, cradled by ancient, gnarled peaks that bruised the sky, it existed in a perpetual twilight of rumor and half-truths. The few who had ever stumbled upon it, or so the whispers went, returned with eyes too wide and words too few, speaking of an unnerving quiet and a deep, unsettling reverence in the villagers' gazes. This was the place, the unseen hand of the diocese had decided, that Father Cassius was to call home. Cassius, only 24, had arrived at Stone March shrouded in a melancholic idealism, a heavy cloak woven from past failings and a fervent desire for redemption. The journey itself had been a penance, a slow crawl up winding paths where the air grew thin, and the sunlight seemed to falter. He had believed, with a youthful certainty, that this desolate posting was his opportunity to truly serve, to bring the light of mercy and forgiveness to a forgotten people. He had imagined teaching them about grace, about a God who loved unconditionally, even in the harshest of lands. The village itself was a collection of stone houses huddled together, as if for warmth against an unseen chill. The land surrounding it was parched, the soil cracked and dusty, resembling an old man's skin. What little vegetation remained was brittle, sighing with every dry gust of wind. It was autumn, but the trees offered no golden leaves, only skeletal branches reaching towards a perpetually pale sky. The villagers had greeted Cassius with a solemn silence, their faces weathered and their eyes holding a depth that bespoke generations of hardship. They never spoke a word of welcome, simply watched him. He was told that he would be housed in a small, stark room attached to the village's spiritual heart, a squat, ancient stone shrine. It was a modest structure, lacking the grandeur of the cathedrals he knew, yet its weathered stones hummed with an almost palpable reverence. Small, intricate carvings, worn smooth by countless hands, adorned its entrance, depicting stoic figures offering up bundles of grain and stoic animals. The villagers, he noted, always averted their gaze from these carvings directly, as if the images held a power too great to confront head-on. Cassius, finding no grand congregation, had set about his duties with an earnestness born of his desire for atonement. He offered blessings, though no one knelt. He spoke of parables, though the villagers listened with an unnerving stillness, their expressions unreadable. He tried to engage them, to understand their struggles, particularly the deepening drought that threatened to choke the very life out of Stone March. The meager fields, once green, were now a uniform, dust-blown ochre. The well, they explained through one of the younger women who seemed less burdened by the village's perpetual silence, was nearly dry. It was during these initial, unsettling weeks that Cassius had his first meaningful encounter with Old Man Willard. Willard was the village elder, his face a road map of deep-set wrinkles, his eyes the color of river stones. He moved with a slow, deliberate dignity that spoke of immense authority. Cassius was told that Willard was the keeper of the village's memory, the voice of its ancient ways. Willard had sought Cassius out one evening, observing him as he meticulously cleaned the shrine's small, unadorned altar. The old man had spoken, his voice raspy like dry leaves, stating that the village appreciated the new priest's efforts, but that he ought to understand that Stone March had its own ways, its own understanding of God's will. He had explained that for generations, they had existed under a unique covenant with the great provider, a pact that predated even the memory of his own grandfather's grandfather. He simply stated that the land was growing tired, and that the provider's patience was wearing thin. Cassius, trying to understand, had asked what that meant. Willard had merely offered a grim smile and walked away, leaving Cassius with a prickle of unease that settled deep in his bones. As the days bled into weeks, the drought tightened its grip like a starved hand. The last vestiges of green withered to brown, and the air grew heavy with the smell of dust and dying things. Cassius, his idealism clashing with the grim reality, had tried to organize the villagers, suggesting they dig deeper wells, or ration water more carefully. He spoke of human ingenuity, of perseverance, of a God who helped those who helped themselves. But the villagers had merely listened with their characteristic quiet respect, their eyes fixed on him, as though his words were mere sounds on the wind. They had explained, through Willard, that such human efforts were futile when the provider was displeased. They knew, they said, what must be done. Cassius had begun to hear hushed conversations, fragmented whispers carried on the dry wind. They spoke of the time of reckoning, of what must be offered, of the greatest gift. He had felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He had seen similar traditions in history books, in isolated pockets where ancient fears still thrived. He had mentally steeled himself to preach against animal sacrifice, to remind them that God desired a contrite heart, not the blood of a lamb. He had even, in his darkest moments, wrestled with the horrific thought of human sacrifice, the kind whispered about in old wives' tales, a notion he quickly dismissed as impossible in the modern age, even here. Yet the chill lingered. One evening, Willard had summoned Cassius to the edge of the dying fields, the vast expanse of cracked earth stretching out endlessly under a bruised, twilight sky. The old man's silhouette against the setting sun had seemed to grow, taking on an almost monstrous quality. Willard had spoken, his voice devoid of emotion, of the ancient compact that bound Stone March. He had explained that when the land stopped producing, when the great provider withheld its bounty, the village had to give back what was most precious. He had then dismissed Cassius's unspoken questions about animal offerings, stating that such trivial things were only for minor displeasures. The true sacrifice, the one that placated the provider when all else failed, had to be something of spirit, something truly irreplaceable. Cassius, a tremor of dread running through him, had asked what could be more precious than a life. Willard had simply turned his head, his gaze unsettling, his words veiled but menacing, stating that the village knew what was truly precious, and that the new priest would soon understand. Cassius had felt a profound sense of doom, his past failings, his imagined unworthiness, returning to haunt him. He wondered if this truly was his penance, a dark fate he was powerless to escape. As the drought intensified, the village began to prepare, not for a harvest, but for a ritual. The villagers, their faces etched with a grim determination, cleaned the shrine with a meticulous solemnity that unsettled Cassius. They polished its ancient stones, not with reverence, but with an almost surgical precision. They gathered tools, not farming implements, but heavy mallets, chisels, and ropes coiled tightly, tools of demolition, not cultivation. Cassius, increasingly agitated, had confronted Willard, demanding to know their true intent. He had tried to appeal to the old man's sense of humanity, of Christian mercy, reminding him of God's love, of the sanctity of life. He had spoken of the unholy nature of blood sacrifice, pleading with Willard to reconsider, to allow him to pray for rain, to seek a different path. Willard had listened, his eyes unblinking, before leading Cassius to the shrine. The air around the ancient building felt charged, heavy with an unspoken tension. He had explained, his voice a low, steady drone, that for generations, the villagers had always given what was most precious. Not an animal, not a child, though Cassius confessed later to himself that he had feared this above all else. But the very symbol of their faith, the heart of their spiritual life, the physical manifestation of their devotion, the shrine itself. Willard had explained that only by destroying what they worshipped could they truly show their unwavering submission and receive favor again. It was a test, a brutal act of faith, a severing of attachment to earthly representations, allowing the true spiritual to flow forth. He stated that the provider did not want a mere offering of life, but the complete submission of their souls, proven by the destruction of that which they held dearest. The revelation had hit Cassius like a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. To destroy the house of God, the place of worship, was an act of ultimate sacrilege in his faith, a violation of everything he held sacred. Yet, for these people, it was the ultimate act of devotion, a terrifying, inverted liturgy. He had stared at Willard, his mind reeling, and that was when the final, horrifying truth had settled upon him. Willard had not merely been explaining their tradition, he had been informing Cassius of his role. The old man had made it terribly clear, without ever raising his voice, that if Cassius refused to lead this ritual of desecration, if he withheld what was deemed the most precious sacrifice, then he would be deemed to be standing in the way of the provider's will. And thus, he would become the offering instead. Cassius had found himself caught between two terrifying faiths. His own, which forbade the desecration of the sacred, and theirs, which demanded it to save his life and, they believed, their village. His past failures whispered in his mind, accusing him of weakness, of unworthiness. He had seen the desperate, hard faces of the villagers, their gaunt children with eyes too old for their years, and he had understood the depth of their fear, their devotion. He had wrestled with the impossible choice, martyrdom versus survival, the sanctity of a building versus the sanctity of his own soul, and perhaps the souls of these people, whom he had, after all, come to save. He had, in a moment of desperate, twisted clarity, reasoned that if he survived, if he endured this blasphemy, he could perhaps, one day, guide them towards a gentler God, a different kind of faith. The villagers had gathered at dawn, a silent, expectant multitude. The air was thick with the scent of dry earth and unspoken prayers. Willard, his face impassive, had handed Cassius a heavy stone hammer, its head smooth and dark with age and countless uses. The silence was profound, broken only by the dry rasp of the wind. Cassius had felt the eyes of every villager on him, cold and unwavering, waiting. He had known they were waiting for him to lead. With a sickening lurch in his stomach, a guttural cry trapped in his throat, Cassius had raised the hammer. He had thought of the cross, of Christ's suffering, of the very foundations of his beliefs crumbling into dust. He had brought the hammer down, not with power, but with a shuddering despair, striking the ancient wooden door of the shrine. The sound had echoed, shockingly loud in the silence, a terrible crack that shattered not only the wood but something fragile within his own soul. The narrator of this tale had heard that the destruction had been slow, agonizing. Cassius, driven by self-preservation, but also by that desperate, twisted logic, that perhaps this was a form of sacrifice, perhaps this was the only way to survive and bring a different kind of faith to these people later, had joined the villagers in dismantling the shrine. He had smashed the altar, a dull thud against stone. He had pulled down the sacred cloths, their ancient weave tearing with a horrifying rip. He had watched the carved figures tumble from their niches, their stone gazes now fixed on the dusty earth. Each act had been a violation, tearing at his soul, but he had forced himself onward, fueled by a primal fear and a desperate, half-formed hope. The villagers had watched, their faces unreadable, their silence a heavy weight. Days later, or perhaps it had been a week, the sky had darkened. Not with the usual pale, dry haze, but with bruised, heavy clouds. The heavens had opened, and a torrential downpour, unlike anything the villagers had seen in years, had drenched the parched land. The rain had fallen relentlessly, washing away the dust, soaking the cracked earth, creating rivulets that turned into rushing streams. The villagers rejoiced, their cries echoing through the valley, but their celebration was muted, almost grim, offered not with joyous abandon but with a grim satisfaction. They had offered thanks, but to whom, or what, was unclear. Cassius was alive, but broken. The rain, a symbol of divine blessing, now felt like a mockery. He had desecrated everything he held dear, had violated his most sacred vows. He questioned his faith, his God, his very identity. He saw the villagers' land slowly revive, saw the shoots of green emerge from the saturated earth, but he felt no joy, only a profound, echoing emptiness. The narrator had concluded that no one truly knew what became of Father Cassius. Some said he remained in the village of Stone March, a priest without a church, a shepherd without a flock, forever haunted by his actions, walking the revived fields with a vacant stare. Others claimed he simply vanished, swallowed by the same mysterious mountains that had once concealed his penance. No one could say if the village ever truly rebuilt its shrine, or if the ancient compact would one day demand another, even more terrible, sacrifice, its terms perhaps forever altered by the young priest's terrible choice. The story, the narrator would always finish, served as a chilling reminder that sometimes, the price of life is the death of belief, and some mysteries, some faiths, are better left undisturbed in the shadow of mountains too old to care. Faith can be built, or it can be broken with a hammer, and the rain that comes afterwards will taste like blood and ashes. But which is better, to die for your faith or to live with its ruins in your soul? An unanswered question. But sometimes destroying something is just the beginning. Sometimes the next step is to take what is not yours. For example, in an old cemetery. Here's a story that will tell you about the true price of a flower that promises eternity. The tale came to me second-hand, from old man Tiber, the groundskeeper at Blackwood Asylum. He claimed it was whispered to him by a former patient, a man obsessed with local folklore. It concerned the cemetery of Hollow's Rest, a place shunned even by the most hardened locals, a forgotten patch of earth where the condemned had been interred for centuries, their names largely erased from official records, their sins a collective stain on the land. According to the legend, deep within its overgrown confines, a flower bloomed, a botanical impossibility said to grant eternal youth to whoever dared to pluck it. Yet the lore insisted on a steep price, not a flower in return, nor a coin, but a piece of one's very soul, yielded only after uttering the true, forgotten name of a deceased interred beneath the hallowed ground. Old man Tiber had always emphasized the chilling coda to the tale, a stark warning against desecration. The dead, he would mutter, did not forgive trespassers who mocked their eternal slumber, nor those who sought to steal their peace for a fleeting gain. They would, he assured me with a shiver, eventually come to claim their due. It was this very legend that drew a peculiar quartet to the desolate outskirts of town, their minds alight with the thrill of debunking, the allure of scientific discovery, and perhaps, the faint, unacknowledged flicker of a more primal greed. There was Joshua Carlson, a historian whose cynicism was as meticulously cultivated as his tweed jackets. He had declared the legend to be little more than a morbid local fantasy, a quaint embellishment to a very real, very neglected burial ground. His interest, he had always maintained, lay solely in documenting the socio-cultural aspects of local superstition. Accompanying him was Seraphina Bellwether, a botanist whose ambition often outshone her caution. She had often articulated her fervent desire to discover a species of such profound rarity, one that might rewrite textbooks and secure her legacy. The notion of a flower granting eternal youth, while scientifically impossible in her view, nonetheless presented an irresistible intellectual challenge, perhaps an unknown medicinal property, a unique genetic anomaly. She had expressed her eagerness to analyze its cellular structure, confident in finding a mundane explanation. Rhys Morgan, a documentarian whose camera was as much an extension of his arm as it was a means to an end, had seen in the legend the potential for a groundbreaking film. He had often spoken of capturing the raw human reaction to the unknown, of exposing the gullibility of belief against the cold light of rationality. He envisioned a thrilling expose, a viral sensation that would make his career. The idea of people genuinely believing such a fantastical tale was, he considered, a goldmine for his art. Finally, there was Clara Hayes, a psychologist whose skepticism was a professional shield against the irrationality of the human mind. She had often asserted that all supernatural phenomena could be explained by psychological biases, mass hysteria, or simple delusion. Her purpose in joining them, she had explained, was to observe the group dynamics, the creeping suggestibility, and the eventual disillusionment that she fully anticipated. She saw it as a unique field study into the human capacity for self-deception. They had arrived at the cemetery gate in a borrowed SUV, the air thick with an unspoken mixture of anticipation and disdain. Joshua had scoffed at the rusted ironwork, remarking on the neglect, a testament, he believed, to the local community's misplaced priorities. Serafina had immediately begun cataloging the hardy, invasive flora, musing aloud about the resilience of nature in such an inhospitable environment. Rhys, ever the professional, had already begun filming, his lens sweeping across the crumbling stone archway, capturing the atmospheric desolation. Clara had simply observed, her gaze sharp, already anticipating the inevitable psychological unraveling of belief. The path into Hollow's Rest was less a path and more a suggestion, swallowed whole by grasping ivy and thorny brambles. Ancient oak trees, gnarled and skeletal even in full leaf, cast long, distorted shadows that seemed to writhe with a life of their own. The air grew perceptibly colder, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. Headstones, tilted at drunken angles, bore inscriptions long eroded by time, their names lost to the ages. Some were mere nubs of stone poking from the soil, others shattered into fragments, swallowed by creeping moss. It was a place where memory itself seemed to have surrendered. Joshua, consulting a tattered map he had photocopied from some obscure municipal archive, had declared that the oldest section, where the condemned were said to lie, was deeper still, beyond a particularly dense thicket of thorns. He had expressed a certain academic satisfaction in locating the purported heart of the legend. Serafina, invigorated by the challenge, had pushed ahead, her tools clanking softly against her pack as she cleared a path, her eyes scanning for any unusual botanical specimens. Rhys, camera held steady, had documented every step, every rustle of leaves, every creak of the ancient trees, narrating his observations in a low, intense whisper for his audience. Clara, ever watchful, had noted the subtle shift in their demeanor, the way their voices had lowered, their movements had grown more deliberate, a nascent reverence beginning to subtly undermine their initial bravado. They had eventually stumbled into a clearing, a bowl-like depression ringed by particularly ancient, nameless graves. The headstones here were almost entirely consumed by a dark, resilient lichen, their forms grotesque and indistinct. In the very center, bathed in a sliver of weak moonlight that pierced the canopy, was the flower. It was unlike anything Serafina had ever seen, or even theorized. Its petals, a luminous, almost ethereal white, pulsed with a faint, internal luminescence. The bloom itself was impossibly perfect, unfurling in a spiral of such intricate symmetry that it seemed to mock the imperfections of the surrounding decay. It grew from a single, slender stem that appeared to emerge directly from the barren earth, with no visible root system or surrounding foliage. It radiated a faint, sweet scent, subtly intoxicating, like honeysuckle mixed with something ancient and forgotten. Serafina had approached it first, her scientific curiosity overriding her ingrained skepticism. She had whispered about its impossible beauty, about its apparent defiance of known botanical principles. She had reached out a gloved hand, her fingers hovering inches from a petal that seemed to shimmer with an inner light. Joshua, observing her intense focus, had remarked on the apparent artistry of nature, even in such a desolate place, though he still privately attributed its unique qualities to some obscure chemical reaction in the soil. Reese, in his element, had captured the flower from every angle, his internal monologue focused on the dramatic reveal for his documentary. Clara, however, had felt a prickle of something beyond mere psychological observation, a coldness that seeped into her bones, an inexplicable sense of being watched. She had felt a strange, compelling urge, a whisper in the back of her mind, telling her to turn back, to leave this place. But their ambition, their disbelief, was a powerful force. Joshua had finally stepped forward, a smirk playing on his lips. He had declared that if the legend were true, it would be the ultimate historical irony. He had challenged the others, asking who among them was brave enough to pluck the legendary bloom. Seraphina, her eyes still fixated on the flower, had said that if it truly was a plant, it deserved to be studied. Reese had insisted that for the sake of the documentary, for the sake of the story, someone had to do it. Clara, despite her burgeoning unease, had observed that observing the act itself would provide invaluable insight into the psychology of belief and consequence. They had drawn lots, a gallows humor permeating the ritual. The short straw had fallen to Joshua. He had grumbled good-naturedly, calling it a predictable outcome, considering his vocal disbelief. With a theatrically exaggerated sigh, he had knelt before the luminous flower. He had then looked at his comrades, a nervous chuckle escaping him as he asked them what name he was supposed to conjure, if indeed the whole thing was not a mass of fabrication. Seraphina, after a moment of intense thought, had consulted a faded paper she carried, a fragment of a burial record she'd found in an obscure archive. She had suggested the name, Elias Thorne, a man condemned for sorcery in the late 17th century, whose burial place was noted as unconsecrated ground within Hollow's Rest. Joshua, with a final, dismissive shrug, had reached out. His fingers had closed around the delicate stem. He had felt a strange, almost electric tingling, as if the flower were humming with a barely contained energy. Then, with a defiant lift of his chin, he had uttered the name, his voice echoing slightly in the oppressive silence, Elias Thorne. The flower had come away in his hand with surprising ease, its luminescence flaring briefly before settling into a softer glow. A profound silence had descended upon the clearing. For a moment, nothing happened. Joshua had laughed, a short, self-satisfied sound, and had declared the whole affair a sham, a clever botanical trick, and a testament to the power of suggestion. He had then placed the pulsing flower carefully into a small, airtight container Seraphina had provided, already imagining the dissecting microscope. Yet, as they had turned to leave the clearing, a subtle change had begun to manifest. Joshua, who had always possessed a quick wit and a sharp tongue, had found his thoughts growing muddled. He had tried to articulate a particularly cutting remark about the gullibility of common folk, but the words had seemed to catch in his throat, forming only a garbled, incomplete thought. He had felt a peculiar emptiness, as if a small, vital part of his intellectual spark had simply vanished. He had dismissed it as exhaustion, the chill of the cemetery, or perhaps a delayed reaction to the absurdity of the ritual. Reese, witnessing the apparent success, had decided that for the sake of his footage, for the complete narrative, he too must participate. He had expressed his belief that a true documentarian immersed himself fully in the subject. He had then knelt, consulting the same record. He had chosen the name, Agnes Finch, a woman accused of witchcraft and interred somewhere nearby. He had spoken her name with a dramatic flourish, and plucked another of the luminous blooms. Again, a brief flare, then a soft glow. Almost immediately, Reese's vision had seemed to sharpen, the colors of the cemetery deepening, the textures of the ancient stones becoming incredibly vivid. He had felt a surge of energy, a heightened perception that he immediately attributed to adrenaline, to the thrill of the moment. He had then raised his camera, attempting to capture the intricate etching on a nearby headstone, but his hand had trembled uncontrollably. The image in his viewfinder had blurred, and a sudden, inexplicable sense of despair had washed over him, dulling the vibrant colors he had just perceived. He had tried to articulate his frustration, but the words had escaped him, leaving him with a hollow ache in his chest. He had merely stared at the camera, a profound sense of loss settling over him, as if the very point of his art had suddenly become elusive. Serafina, her scientific curiosity now tinged with a nascent, almost fearful awe, had found herself drawn to the flower once more. She had convinced herself that a direct comparison was essential for her research, that a second specimen would provide valuable control data. She had chosen the name, Thomas Blackwood, a notorious highwayman, whose grave was said to be marked by a shard of obsidian. She had whispered his name, her voice barely audible, and had gently plucked the third flower. Its light had pulsed, a beacon in the encroaching darkness. As she had risen, Serafina had felt a profound clarity, an unparalleled understanding of the interconnectedness of all living things. She had seen the intricate network of roots beneath the soil, the flow of nutrients, the microscopic dance of organisms. But with this revelation, she had also felt a crushing indifference to it all. The passion, the driving ambition that had once fueled her, had simply evaporated. The awe-inspiring complexity of life now seemed meaningless. She had found herself gazing at the flower in her hand, utterly devoid of the impulse to study it, to understand it. Her hands, which once yearned to dissect and analyze, now hung limp, listless. Clara, observing the subtle, yet unsettling, changes in her companions, had felt her scientific detachment crumble. Joshua had lapsed into uncharacteristic silence, his eyes unfocused, his usual sharp intellect dulled. Reese had sat on a fallen gravestone, clutching his camera, a distant, despairing look on his face, his creative fire extinguished. Serafina had simply stood, staring at the flower in her hand, her movements slow, her once vibrant energy replaced by a profound apathy. A chilling realization had begun to dawn on Clara. The price, it seemed, was not a violent extraction, nor a visible wound. It was far more insidious, far more terrifying. She had felt a growing terror, a primal fear that transcended her psychological training. The silence of the cemetery no longer felt peaceful, it felt watchful, expectant. She had felt an undeniable pull towards the final, glowing bloom. She had told herself that she needed to understand, to witness the phenomenon firsthand, to fully comprehend the psychological impact. But a deeper, darker urge had propelled her forward, a desperate hope for something, anything, that might erase the growing despair she felt reflecting off her friends. With trembling hands, Clara had knelt before the last luminous flower. She had searched the tattered record for the most tragic, the most forgotten name, believing that perhaps the magnitude of the sorrow might somehow lessen the price. She had found Lydia Fairweather, a young woman buried in anonymity, condemned for a crime never proven. Clara had whispered the name, her voice barely a breath, and plucked the flower. It had flashed with a brilliant, almost blinding light, then settled into a gentle pulse. Immediately, Clara had felt a blissful peace wash over her, a profound sense of serenity unlike anything she had ever experienced. All her anxieties, all her fears, all her doubts, had simply vanished. The weight of her past, the uncertainties of her future, the complexities of human emotion, all had dissipated into an exquisite emptiness. She had no desire to analyze, no need to understand, no impulse to question. She had merely existed, a blank slate, devoid of the very essence of her being. The vibrant, pulsating flower in her hand felt utterly irrelevant. The moon had begun its slow descent, its light fading as the first hint of dawn touched the horizon. The clearing was silent, save for the rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth. Joshua sat slumped against a gravestone, a vacant look in his eyes, his once sharp mind now a dull, flickering ember. Reese, his camera lying abandoned beside him, stared blankly at the dark earth, his vibrant spirit replaced by an overwhelming sense of futility. Seraphina stood motionless, the glowing flower still clutched in her hand, her ambition and passion utterly extinguished. Clara, too, remained still, a serene, empty smile gracing her lips, her skepticism, her very self, erased. Old man Tiber, recounting the whispered rumor he had heard, had always concluded with a solemn warning. The dead, he had said, do not forgive. They simply wait. And when their peace is disturbed, they take their price. Not with violence, but with a quiet, insidious theft. A piece of the soul, they say. The part that makes you you. No one, he had always added, had seen the legend hunters since that night. Their SUV had been found abandoned at the edge of the cemetery, its doors ajar, its contents undisturbed. Some whispered that they had achieved their eternal youth, now condemned to wander the earth as hollow echoes of their former selves, forever seeking the pieces of their souls they had so carelessly surrendered. Others, perhaps more merciful, believed they had simply faded, absorbed into the forgotten earth of Hollow's Rest, their names added to the silent chorus of the condemned, their true identities lost to the unforgiving ground, awaiting the next audacious soul to utter their silent call. The flower, it was rumored, still bloomed, eternal and alluring, a silent guardian of the ultimate price. They thought they knew the price of everything: science, intelligence, fame. It turned out that the price was themselves, piece by piece. And now they wander, empty, trying to remember what it means to be alive. But what to do when life is not a gift but a sentence? When you are already trapped, and food is running out? When the only chance to survive is to become something else, something bigger, and more terrible? When the law of the wild demands not just food, but sacrifice? The tale, as it was told to me, begins not with the crash itself, but in the long, silent aftermath. The screech of tearing metal and the shuddering impact were merely the overture. The true horror was the quiet that followed, blanketing the vast, snow-dusted taiga. The fuselage of the small charter plane was a broken-back serpent, half buried in a drift, its exposed innards steaming faintly in the sub-zero air. Of the 12 souls on board, only 5 now drew breath: Lev, the self-proclaimed custodian; Anya, a doctor with steady hands and a pragmatic mind; Dmitri, a man whose military bearing was already beginning to fray at the edges; Irena, a young artist who saw the world in shades others missed; and Boris, an engineer who found solace in the meticulous documentation of their predicament. Their leader was Lev, a man whose gaunt frame and intense eyes spoke of a life dedicated to things beyond the mundane. He was a collector of forgotten lore, a walker of blurred boundaries, and he immediately declared himself their custodian, a title he invested with a gravity that felt archaic and absolute. He spoke of the old laws of the wild, of debts owed to the unforgiving land. He organized their scarce supplies, rationed their hope, and led grim expeditions into the white silence, always returning empty-handed. Hunger, a sharp-toothed companion from the start, soon began to gnaw through their civility. The cold was a physical weight, a thief stealing warmth and reason by degrees. It was on the 8th day, with their food gone and the weak sun offering no warmth, that their first companion succumbed. Pavel, an accountant from Moscow, simply closed his eyes during the long twilight and did not open them again. His death was quiet, almost polite, but it unleashed a silent panic more terrifying than any scream. It was then that Lev gathered the survivors. His voice, when he spoke, was not that of a desperate man, but of a high priest reciting a terrible liturgy. He told them that the modern world, with all its comforts and prohibitions, was a lie. The true, ancient law was survival, and sometimes salvation demanded a terrible price. He spoke of a transference, an archaic rite where the strength of the fallen could be consumed, literally, to fortify the living. He called it the passing. To eat the flesh of the deceased was to break the ultimate taboo, but in doing so, he claimed, the essence of the departed would live on within them, granting not just sustenance, but vigor, a shared strength. Anya, the doctor, revolted. She argued with a cold, clinical fury, citing disease, morality, the very bedrock of human decency. She said it was monstrous. Dmitri, his face a mask of shameful memory, perhaps of other fields and other bodies, initially sided with her. But Lev's words were a slow, insidious poison. He did not debate. He simply stated facts as if they were ancient, unassailable truths. He asked if their hollow stomachs and fading warmth were not more monstrous. He asked if they wished to die as polite guests of a world that had already forgotten them. Hunger and despair were his strongest allies. The silence of the taiga, a great, judging eye, pressed down on them. One by one, their resistance crumbled. Even Anya's scientific rationale eventually buckled under the primal need to see another dawn. The first ritual was a grim, shivering affair. Lev performed it with a solemn, terrifying grace, using a shard of metal from the wreckage. He spoke words in a language none of them recognized, a guttural, clicking tongue that sounded older than the trees. The act itself was a blur of nausea, shame, and a desperate, animalistic relief. The warmth that followed, however, was undeniable. It was more than just caloric. It was a flush of vitality that fought back the cold for a few precious hours. They slept deeply that night, and for the first time, their dreams were not of rescue, but of a profound and unsettling silence. The change was not immediate, but it was inexorable. After the second passing, following the death of a woman named Svetlana, Dmitri found he could stay on watch for hours without feeling the cold bite into his bones. But with the strength came flickers of memory that were not his own, the scent of a particular perfume on a summer evening, the crushing anxiety of a looming tax deadline. He would shake his head, disoriented, haunted by a ghost of another man's mundane worries. It was Irina, the artist, who seemed most receptive to the change. She stopped sketching the stark beauty of their prison and began to draw things she could not possibly know. The exact pattern of the carpet in Pavel's childhood home, the stern face of a man she later, in a flat voice, identified as Svetlana's father. Her own personality began to recede, like a reflection fading from glass, replaced by a detached, composite consciousness. She began to speak in fragments of other people's conversations, her voice a hollow echo. Boris, ever the engineer, documented it all in his water-stained notebook. He noted the increased stamina, the sharpening of senses. He also noted the shared headaches, the moments of collective disorientation, the way they would all sometimes fall silent at once, listening to something none of them could name. He wrote of a psychic bleed-over, a hive mind formation via prionic transmission, trying to cage the uncanny in clinical terms, but his handwriting grew progressively more erratic. And through it all, there was Leviticus. He was their anchor, their dark priest. With each ritual, he seemed to grow stronger, his eyes burning with a fervid light. He would speak of the unity they were achieving, the shedding of their individual weaknesses to become something greater, a single organism forged in the crucible of the wild. He promised they would become native to this place, that it would no longer seek to expel them. But they were not just absorbing the memories of the accountant or the secretary. They were absorbing him. Lev's presence in the shared psychic space was immense, volcanic. They began to taste his strange obsessions, the texture of certain rare stones, the cadence of forgotten prayers. They felt his pain, a deep, old ache that was not physical but spiritual, a yearning for a world that had vanished beneath concrete and reason. And they felt his desires. Not simple wants, but primal, ancient hungers. A desire to run on all fours under the moon, to taste hot blood on the tongue, to dominate the silence rather than be cowed by it. The law of the taboo, once broken, could not be unbroken. It had opened a door within each of them, and something had been waiting on the other side. The hunger that now gnawed at them was different. It was no longer a simple craving for calories. It was a deeper, more specific ache. The salvageable parts of the deceased were running out. It was Dmitri who voiced it first, his soldier's pragmatism now twisted by the whispers in his head. He stated, as if discussing a shortage of firewood, that the ritual required a participant. That the passing demanded a sacrifice to continue. He did not look at his living companions, but the unspoken question hung in the air, more frigid than the wind. Anya argued again, but her protests were weaker now. The doctor in her was being suffocated by the creature she was becoming. She could feel the collective will of the group, a terrifying new instinct, turning against her dissent. She could feel their hunger for the power another passing would bring. Boris merely looked up from his notebook, his eyes wide, and asked in a whisper if they had considered the ethical implications of a voluntary offering, as if drafting a macabre contract. Irina simply smiled, a vacant, eerie expression, and said that the forest was listening, and that it was pleased. She said the old blood was stirring, using phrases that were pure Lev. The group dynamic had shattered and reformed into something alien. They were no longer survivors. They were a pack. And Lev was their alpha, his strange rules now their only creed. The civilization they had left behind was not just miles away, it was centuries gone from their minds. The story, as it reaches its end, becomes fragmented. It was told to me by a trapper who found the site much later, who heard the whispers from the few who had braved that part of the woods and returned changed themselves. He spoke of finding Boris's notebook, its final pages a mess of dark, frantic scribbles that spoke of a final unification and a hunt under the full moon. He said the wreckage was there, but the bodies of the dead were gone, consumed down to the bone. Of the 5 survivors, there was no sign. No tracks led away into the snow. But the trappers swore that sometimes, on nights when the wind howls just right through the endless trees, you can hear more than just the wind. You can hear the echo of a language that was old before men built cities. You can feel a presence that is both many in one, watching from the deep shadows of the taiga. They had consumed the flesh to survive, and in doing so, they had consumed the wild, archaic soul of their custodian. And it had consumed them back. They broke the commandment to save themselves, and in the void it left behind, something else woke up. And it is still out there. And it is always, always hungry. To consume. To assimilate. To merge. To lose oneself in a crowd of alien memories and hungers. But this is only a consequence. A consequence of something far deeper. What if our entire civilization, all our beliefs, are just a fragile sheet of ice over an abyss? What if we are not the pinnacle of creation, but merely a mistake that was meant to be concealed? What if the true masters of this world are simply waiting? Waiting for us to forget the last spell, for the last priest to renounce faith, for the mind of the last scientist to wither. And then they will return, not for revenge, but for what has always belonged to them. The last story is not just a tale. It is a warning, a letter. My dearest Eleanor, forgive the haste and the lack of customary pleasantries, but a profound and unsettling revelation compels me to commit these words to paper, before I can no longer articulate them with any semblance of coherence. I fear the very ink beneath my pen is already beginning to bleed with the truth I must convey, a truth whispered to me under the most dire circumstances, by a man whose sanity had already fractured under its weight. You remember Professor Alastair Finch, of course. The esteemed historian, the quiet academic whose life was devoted to forgotten texts and obscure church archives. I encountered him again only weeks ago, not in the hushed halls of his university, but in a squalid room above a fishmonger's, his once meticulous appearance replaced by a gaunt, wild-eyed desperation. He beckoned me close, his voice a ragged rasp, claiming that he had uncovered the ultimate deception, a secret so ancient and terrifying that it had driven him to the very brink. He insisted that humanity's entire understanding of itself, our very place in creation, was founded upon a lie, a vast and meticulously constructed edifice of deceit perpetrated by the very institutions we trust most. He began by asserting that we, all of us, were fundamentally mistaken in the main question: who are we? He explained, with a chilling certainty that belied his physical state, that the Church had hidden the truth for centuries, not out of malice, but because the truth did not lead to salvation. On the contrary, he proclaimed, it led only to horror. He told me that everything we believed about being chosen creatures, specially created in some divine image, was a comforting fable. We were not chosen, he maintained. We were the consequences of a catastrophic mistake, a blight in the grand scheme that they, the ancient custodians, had desperately tried to conceal. Professor Finch then launched into a harrowing account of what he had pieced together from fragmented manuscripts, coded liturgical amendments, and the desperate, cryptic confessions of dying cardinals he had once, innocently, dismissed as senile ramblings. He spoke of an initial attempt at creation, a primal genesis that predated what we now understand as the dawn of man. He referred to these first beings as our bloody prototypes, recounting that they were not merely ancestors, but fundamentally different entities, forged from a raw, elemental force that we could barely comprehend. He described them as beings of immense power, yet also of an almost unbearable, visceral reality, their existence predicated on a cyclical consumption and regeneration that was anathema to the more refined, ordered world the subsequent creators sought to establish. He painted a picture of a universe that was, in its nascent stages, a canvas of terrifying, organic processes, where the prototypes moved with an indifferent, brutal grace. They were not evil, he stressed, but simply were. Their existence was the natural order, before the emergence of what he termed the second wave of creation, us. He detailed how our own lineage, humanity, was not a divine ascent, but rather an accidental byproduct, a miscalculation in the attempt to refine or perhaps even replace these original, brutal forms. We were, in essence, a cosmic error, a faulty patch in the fabric of existence, left to flourish in the shadow of what came before. The Church, he explained, had not merely hidden this truth but had actively inverted it. They had taken the story of our accidental genesis and repurposed it as a narrative of divine favor, crafting a comforting mythology to mask the terrifying reality of our origins. The God of their scriptures, he whispered, was not a benevolent creator but a frightened gardener, desperately trying to prune away the monstrous growth of an earlier, more savage bloom. He claimed that the very foundations of our faith, our rituals, our sense of purpose, were all elaborate stratagems designed to keep us ignorant, to maintain the flimsy veil between our fragile reality and the horrifying truth lurking just beyond. And those who were first, he stated, our bloody prototypes, never forgave. How could they? He theorized that they had been shunted aside, diminished, their powerful energies somehow siphoned or contained to make way for our weaker, more pliable selves. He claimed that their existence had not ceased. Instead, they had merely been forced into the periphery, breathing next to us in the darkness, waiting for their time. He described their presence as a constant, underlying hum, an unseen pressure against the walls of our perception, a patient, ancient malevolence that simply was, observing our fleeting existence, remembering the cosmic injustice. Professor Finch, his eyes now wide and bloodshot, then began to describe the signs he had observed, the indicators that their patience had finally worn thin. He spoke of ancient seals weakening, not just in forgotten crypts but in the very fabric of conceptual reality. He recounted how he had begun to discern strange patterns in historical cataclysms, not as random events, but as rhythmic spasms, subtle tremors signaling the approach of something vast and terrible. He claimed that the rising tide of global unrest, the inexplicable surges of primal violence, the collective despair that seemed to blanket humanity, these were not merely social phenomena but the subtle reverberations of their awakening, the first tendrils of their influence seeping into our world. He told me of specific incidents, not mere tales, but things he had personally witnessed or directly verified through his contacts in various clandestine historical circles. He recounted how several isolated religious communities, known for their extreme asceticism and connection to ancient, pre-Christian rites, had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only an unbearable stench and a profound, chilling silence. He described how archival photographs from the early 20th century, once showing ordinary landscapes, now, under certain angles of light, seemed to reveal fleeting, elongated shadows in the periphery, or impossibly sharp, unblinking eyes watching from deep within the foliage. He swore that the very air in certain ancient sites, once imbued with a sense of peace, now thrummed with a palpable, predatory anticipation. The professor's voice grew increasingly frantic as he spoke of how the prototypes were beginning to reclaim their stolen inheritance. He saw their influence in the growing erosion of human empathy, in the subtle ways our collective consciousness seemed to be shifting towards a more primal, self-destructive impulse. He was convinced that they weren't manifesting as grotesque monsters in the simplistic sense. Instead, he believed they were infecting the very essence of reality, subtly altering the laws of physics, blurring the lines between dream and waking, subtly asserting their original, bloody dominance over a world that had forgotten its true landlords. He claimed that people were not being physically attacked in the traditional sense, but that their identities were being slowly, inexorably unraveled, their minds dissolving into a primordial fear, leaving behind only shuddering husks that echoed with ancient, forgotten screams. He spoke of a growing sense of hunger, not for food, but for something far more fundamental, something that consumed identity and replaced it with a hollow, resonant echo of an older suffering. He whispered that he had seen them, or rather, felt them. He described a suffocating presence, a shift in the very texture of the air, a scent like ozone and old blood when no such things should have been present. He insisted that he could hear a low hum, a deep resonant thrum that vibrated not in his ears, but in his very bones. He told me that he had woken in the dead of night to find his room bathed in a light that was not light, but an absence, a void that seemed to suck the color from the world, and in that void, he sensed shapes moving, not distinct forms, but outlines of immense, impossible geometries that defied sanity. He wept as he confessed that he could feel their ancient resentment, their unforgiving patience, pressing against the fragile barrier of his mind. He concluded his terrifying monologue by saying that the time had come. He implored me to understand that this was not a prophecy of a future event, but a description of what was already unfolding, a slow, inevitable reassertion of the original order. He said that the veil was tearing, not with a dramatic flourish, but with the insidious crawl of unraveling threads, revealing the monstrous tapestry behind it. He begged me to share the truth, to warn others, knowing full well the futility of it, knowing that understanding might bring only greater despair, but driven by a desperate need to not let it happen in silence. His last coherent words before he lapsed into a fit of shuddering, primal fear were that they were here, truly here, and that the comforting lie of our chosen nature was dissolving, replaced by the chilling reality of our impending reabsorption. Eleanor, since that encounter, I have felt it too. The air seems heavier, the shadows deeper. There are moments when a low thrum resonates just beneath my hearing, a vibration that feels as if it originates not from sound, but from the very ground beneath my feet, from the deep, dark places of the world. I find myself glancing over my shoulder, seeing fleeting movements that vanish upon closer inspection. The faces of strangers seem to hold a new, unsettling blankness, a distant horror in their eyes that I never noticed before. The world feels thinner. I write to you not to offer comfort, for there is none, but to pass on this burden of knowledge. Perhaps, in some desperate corner of your mind, you might find a way to make sense of what Professor Finch revealed, or at least to recognize the signs for what they are when they come for you. I hear a faint scratching at my window, though no branch is near. It sounds like something immense, something with claws slowly testing the glass. The light outside is fading, Eleanor, and it is not yet sunset. With the gravest of fears, your devoted and utterly terrified friend, Marcus. That's it. 4 stories. 4 ways to lose everything: faith, reason, individuality, reality. To give your soul for rain. To give your mind for a flower. To give your being for power. And finally to realize that your soul never existed, that it is just an illusion that was given to us so that we would not go crazy from the truth. Do you still think that you know how the world works? Do you still believe that your mind, your soul, belong to you? Listen. In the silence, between the sounds of this world, you can hear a rustle, a creak, a hum. They have always been there, and they are waiting. Waiting for us to destroy our own sanctuaries. Waiting for us to give away parts of ourselves. Waiting for us to eat each other. And then they will simply stop waiting. Cover your ears. Close your eyes. It won't help. They're already here. They've always been here. Good night.